Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do an after-action style report of a scenario from Traces of War from Vuca Simulations. But before we jump in and take a look at the opening positions, let's give a little bit of backdrop to what this game represents in historical context. We start out in August of 1943. There's about 2.5 million Russian troops poised on the Donets River. And this battle really, if you would, consists of two different phases. The first kind of 4 months of the battle really is the race for the Dnieper River. Russian forces are trying to get troops across and establish crossing points across the Dnieper River to basically create strong points and strongholds that they can push further west from in the next 4 months of the campaign. Now, in real life, this was a sweeping success for the Russian forces, although there were heavy casualties on both sides. The game represents this dual nature of the Russian offensive by giving you basically two scenarios. The first scenario is 4 months long, and it's the Russian drive for the Dnieper River. Basically, the Russians trying to get as many forces across the river and establish crossing points as they can. The second scenario the game offers is the full campaign game, where the first 4 months are essentially the same, and then the next 4 months is what happens once the Russians get across the Dnieper River, driving further to the west and pushing the Germans back. So as we start the game, as you can imagine, the Russians are on the offensive, the Germans trying to give up ground as grudgingly as they can. Let's jump in and take a look at our starting positions. Here's a look at our operational situation in August of 1943. Roughly speaking, this is most all of the map. We just can't see a little bit to the south here, which includes Odessa down here. But we have our Russian forces poised here on the east side of the battlefield, a massive offensive formation. And also, this over here represents Soviet reinforcements. I don't have the counters here, but they will be coming in and they'll be able to be fairly active quickly. So what we see on the map for the Russian forces is going to get further reinforced by significant numbers. Now, the Germans, of course, scattered in a defensive line in front of them, largely following the Donets River down here, which runs this way. Now, as we mentioned, there are two scenarios in this game. We're going to play the first one, which is the race for the Dnieper, the battle for the Dnieper River, which runs here. So this, basically, this line here, this river, represents the Soviet victory objectives. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail because it's a victory point decided game and only victory points go to the Soviets. The victory point total is 50 points for the Soviets, and the way they get them in this scenario is twofold. They need to capture these crossing points. There are 6 of them on the map. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each one of these crossing points is worth 5 victory points. The Soviets need 50, so if they get all 6, they've got 30 victory points. The second victory conditions for them are they get points for units that get across the Dnieper River, whether they're in supply or out of supply. So roughly for the Soviets to win this four-turn scenario and win the Battle of the Dnieper River, they have to take most, if not all, of these crossing points and probably get like about 20 to 30 units across the river. So that's a tall order in 4 turns. However, they have a good amount of force to be able to do that. From the German perspective, they're trying to basically hold the line as best they can. And let's jump in now and take a closer look at each kind of the frontier and think about what our strategies will be for the Russians and then for the Germans. We'll take a look at the north, central, and then southern sections of the map and think about strategy for each one of those 3 areas. We're looking now at the northernmost part of the front, and we'll notice here this is a lot of Soviet forces. In the game there is a 2-unit stacking limit, and the Russian forces have 2s in a lot of these places, a lot of armor up here, and a lot of strong forces. You'll notice also that the Donets River ends right here. So there's no river really impeding the progress of the Soviet forces right here. And this granular terrain is rough terrain, which grants a defensive bonus. That ends right here, so there is a very clear gap right here. So the first, I think, point of emphasis for our Soviet offensive is going to be to try to push through somewhere here, break down this defense and push through here and explode into the open plain behind that, driving over to the west to Kiev and then perhaps down in behind the German forces, forcing them to withdraw from the Donets River. The central portion of the battle centers on Kharkiv right here. All the German forces are behind the Donets River. They have a weak spot in their forces here that really is rather thinly defended here. But likewise, the Soviets, as the Russians, we don't have a tremendous preponderance of force here. We do have a number of corps back here that we perhaps can shovel to the west. So I think that's going to be a second point of emphasis, is to see if we can break the line here, basically trying to test the line in as many places as we can. But if we could break through here, this is pretty much open sailing here behind Kharkov. This line of defense where the Germans are is largely in rough terrain and protected by rivers, but once the Russians get through that, they've got some pretty quick moving here. So that's our second option. With that in mind, I might try to bring in our first group of reinforcements. There's a railhead right here. We could bring them right in here, activate them, and then push them through to Kharkov. So that's our second thinking here. Looking at the south, I see fewer opportunities for the Russian forces, and I see an easier time for the Germans on the defensive. This is all both rough terrain and behind the Donets River. So I'm thinking we might even want to withdraw some of these German forces towards the north to see if where I think they're going to be more desperately needed. I feel like at this point we might be able to hold down here. Having said that, as the Russians, it probably makes sense to attack where possible, see if we can break through the line. And with that, I'm going to go ahead now and fight the August turn here for both the Germans and the Soviets. We'll take a look in a month's time and report back on how the progress has gone. There's two things I'm looking for, really three things I'm looking for as I play this game that I also want to comment on. One is, how much fun is it? How interesting are the decisions? Two, what's it like to play the Germans in this game? Because this is very much a defensive kind of a battle for them. I'm looking for interesting decisions for the defender. Are they just a punching bag, or they got some good options there? And then three, how good is this solitaire? I want to kind of focus a little bit on that too, to see what kind of a solitaire experience this provides. We'll be back in September of 1943. Before we look at the results from our first turn, I want to kind of show how units are activated in the game. Basically, there is a command and control. There are 4 headquarter units. We're looking for the Soviets and 4 for the Germans. And you pick the headquarters that you want to activate in a particular turn. You throw these chits into a big pool, and then you pick them out one at a time. And the units in the command range of that headquarters goes and activates, can either move and fight or fight and move when you pick a particular chit. Now, there's some rules that are involved with this, but roughly the Soviets have 6 chits that they can pick on any given turn, and you have to pick each one of these fronts at least once. So the first turn for the Soviets, we picked each front once. We picked the Vorozhna front, which was way up north because we wanted them to go again. And then I added the reinforcement one in there because I wanted to bring more units in for the Soviets. So these were the 6 things that happened for the Soviets in the first turn. Likewise, the Germans have chits that we're throwing into the pool as well. They have 1 for each of their 4 headquarters and zones in the game. They also, starting on turn 2, they have these OKH. And the Germans have 2 special things. One is that the number varies. So the first turn, the Germans only had 3 headquarters units that they could activate, so we had to leave one of them out. I believe it was the 8th Army on the first turn. But the Germans can also opt to hold these chits off to the side and not drop them into the pool until at any point in the turn they want to do so. So that allows the Germans, for example, to have to go second in a turn. So in the first turn, I had this 6th Army chit not in the pool until the Soviet Southern Front went, because I wanted them to go first. Then once they went, I had this which was activated, I chucked it into the pot, so that I knew that they were going to go after the Soviets went. Now, the OKH chits are rather unique. They do some pretty cool things. We'll talk about those in a little bit further ahead here. Lastly, there is a supply chit that is common to both sides. This goes into the game, and when this is picked, both sides have to check for supply. The end result of this seems really cool because you don't really know when you're going to get a chance to go and who's going to go, even though the Germans have some options here for kind of preempting the Soviet actions, which allows the Germans to be a little bit more flexible from a command standpoint. So it's a pretty cool system. I really like how it's playing so far. So the battle has raged on for a month, and if there's anything to sum it up as we kind of look at the overall front lines here, is that the Germans have done outstandingly well. They have lost 3 infantry divisions so far. They were able to take out a Russian armored division, but it seems like every key attack that the Russians tried to make, both up here in the north, then down here along the Donets River, it failed. Now the Russians, to be fair here, I feel like have rolled extraordinarily poorly on their first turn. There were a number of attacks that had 2/3 chance to go well, and they failed on them. There were like 5 or 6 of those. It was pretty remarkably bad offensive attacking for the Soviets. Nevertheless, they have made some progress and thinned the lines up here in the north. That's probably the biggest result so far. And they have pushed forward a little bit here towards this. At one element down in here, I thought the Donets River ran this way. Donets River ran this way. This is a gap in here, and the Soviets have managed to move forward a little bit, but the Germans have plugged that gap. So all in all, I feel like the Soviets are off to a pretty poor start. Let's take a close look at each front. So as we take a look at the north here, I just want to talk a little bit about how headquarters are activated. Here is the Soviet Vorozhna headquarters, and it has a number 6 on there, which is basically the range. So when this chit gets pulled out of the pot, the Soviets can activate any unit within 6 hexes of this headquarters, and your options are either fight and move, or move and then fight. So that's basically how the headquarters system works in the game. And this was the one that was double activated for the Soviets in the first turn. Now, Soviets had they pushed forward a little here, but the Germans were able to activate the 4th Panzer Army right at the end of the first turn, and were able to plug a lot of the gaps. The Russians did wipe out 3 of these German infantry divisions. The Germans, to their benefit, caught a Russian armored corps overextended, were able to counterattack with some panzers in here and wipe it out. Now, there are 3 units here. This one here, this one here, this one here, that's half strength. So the Soviets, despite rolling incredibly badly, were able to kind of cause some damage up here and make a little bit of progress. Also brought in some reinforcements. So as we go to the second turn, it is imperative, because this is only a 4-turn scenario, that the Soviets break through better here. So far, big credit to the Germans, who have been able to kind of hold the line to a large degree up here. There is some precarious positions here and some weak spots though, so the Soviets going to try to break through on the second turn. In the middle, the Soviets again, and had I think 3 or 4 really good attacks to try to break across the Donets River here, which pretty much runs the whole length of this central part. And every single one of them failed, despite really good odds. It was just miraculously bad die rolling for the Soviets there. Their offensives just sputtered out. Now, I did bring in a good amount of reinforcements here to try to push through this bulge here, see if we can take Kharkov as the Russians. I would like to think we can achieve a breakthrough here. And again, if we can break through right here, there's a lot of clear, I mean, some rivers and stuff like that, but terrain-wise, it's got some open ground in here behind us. But basically, this was fought to a standstill with the Soviets bringing in reinforcements in the first turn. Down in the south, as I mentioned, I thought the Donets River went all the way down here, but there's a minor river that ends here, and the Donets goes this way. So this space in here, it's roughly what, about 80 miles or so? This opening gap here has no rivers to defend behind. That's where the Soviets were able to push forward a little bit, but there really isn't a lot of force to get good odds. And when units attack across a river like here, their attack strength is halved, and these would be disastrous attacks for the Soviets, to be honest. So this has been rather kind of a point of not really much emphasis, although I would like to see if the Soviets now can push through here and try to get a breakthrough here into this part, maybe coming down and taking Stalino and threatening over here to the west a little bit. But that's pretty much it at the end of it. The Germans were able to pull some units off here. We can see here, this is a unit that's been pulled off. Here, the unit's been pulled off to try to shovel these up to the central and northern theaters, if you would, fronts, because that seems to me to be a place that's going to be in greater need. We did move 1 Panzer division right up in here to plug this gap, but it looks really good for the Germans down here. It's the north that looks to be in the most trouble. And with that, takes us to the end of our first turn. We'll now go into turn 2 of 4. Can the Russians start to push through? I feel like they are well behind schedule. There are some weak spots in the German lines, however. Let's see what happens in turn 2. We'll be back at the end to take a look at the results. Before we take a look at our September 1943 results, I want to talk a little bit about another mechanic, which is this Supreme Command Order. At the start of the battle, 6 German-held cities are tagged with the Supreme Command Order, which basically means hold at all costs. And this leads to another way that the Russian player can automatically win the game. If the Russian player takes one of these 6 cities that are tagged with the Supreme Command hold at all costs order, while this command is still in place on that city, the Russian player automatically wins the game. So that means, as the German commander, you've got to manage these and try to get these lifted, to try to convince the Army High Command to let you abandon that city before the Russians take it. And that is where these OKH chits come into play. OKH stands for Oberkommando des Heeres, which is the Army High Command of Germany that managed the war on the East Front. And you get 2 of these chits starting on the second turn. So if the German player, for example, on the September 1943 player, as the German player, we had 4 chits that we could drop into the pool. I picked 2 fronts, and then I picked these 2 OKH chits, because these OKH chits are really powerful. They can be played in 2 different ways, and they can do 3 different things. So you can either drop them into the pool at the beginning of the turn, so they're pulled out like a regular chit, or you can hold them and play them as an interrupt chit. But let's talk about the 3 things that they do. So one thing that they do, if you pull this out of the pot, or if you play it as an interrupt chit, you can activate any headquarters in the German army. So any one of these 4 headquarters. So that's cool, because that gives you some flexibility. And again, you can play this as an interrupt chit, which means you're holding it in your hand. When another chit gets pulled out of the pot, so say for example, one of the Russian army fronts gets pulled out of the pot, you can, as the German player, you can say, nope, throw that one back in. I'm using one of my OKH chits and I'm activating this particular front, which is really powerful to disrupt the Soviet plans. The second way these can be played, again, either as if you pull them out of the pot or if you play them as an interrupt chit, holding it in your hand, you can activate anywhere from 6 to 10 units, depending upon the status of the Soviet offensive. You can activate 6 to 10 units anywhere on the entire front, which is really powerful if you've got a number of units scattered around that you desperately want to try to save or reposition. The third way you can play it, which you can only play if you pull it out of the bowl, so you have to commit to tossing it into the bowl beforehand, you can't play it as an interrupt chit, is what you can buy what are called negotiation points. And the number you get for the time when you pull it out depends on the status of the Soviet invasion. If it's going really well, you get more. If it's not going so well, you get less. But those negotiation points can be used for 2 things. They can be used to purchase the ability to lift one of these Supreme Command orders, or they can be used to purchase reinforcements. So again, you've got a choice here as the German commander if you pull it out. If I think I'm going to lose that city, I can use the chit to lift the Supreme Command Order, but maybe you think you can hold the city if you had reinforcements. So these OKH chits are really powerful, can be played in 3 different ways for the German players, and have a lot of ability to give the German player kind of active participation in what otherwise is a very defensive war. Let's take a look at our September 1943 results. The biggest thing I can say is the Soviets once again have had less than optimal results. Their offensive has struggled, and they have had once again a dynamic run of horrific luck with some of their offensive attacks. I'll talk more about that as we look at each sector. But I did want to point out here these Supreme Command Orders. We've got one over here in the west, one on Kiev. There was one on Kharkov in here. Here's the 4th one. The 5th one is here. And then the 6th one we can't see. It's down here off the south end of the map down in Odessa. But those are the 6 cities that the Germans have to hold at all costs until they lift by negotiation with the OKH, until they lift the order that it has to be held at all costs. And I did use one of those OKH chits for the Germans to lift the order on Kharkov down here on the border, because the Russian forces, as we can see, are right there. But on the whole, here's where the Russians started, and here's where the Russians have gotten to. It's been a rather abysmal offensive. They really have to crank it up if they're going to have any chance of pulling out a victory in this offensive. Let's take a look at each front in turn. The Northern Front, the Soviets have 2 headquarters up here, and they were able to launch pretty much 3 different attacks up here in the last month, and they've made some progress pushing forward here. But the saga of this Northern Offensive basically are these 3 German panzer divisions. The Russians had trapped them, cut them off basically, and had 4-to-1 attacks on all 3 of these divisions. Now a 4-to-1 attack only fails on a die roll of 1, and if they had gotten any other roll, they would have forced the divisions to retreat, eliminating 2 of them and perhaps reducing 1 to half strength. That would take these 3 divisions out of the front and leave this line in a tatters for the Germans. However, on 3 consecutive 4-to-1 attacks, the Soviets rolled a 1, no effect. These panzer divisions were able to extricate themselves thanks to their high mobility, and they're back in a defensive line that the 4th Panzer Army frantically threw up towards the end of the month. This was such a key and critical opportunity for the Germans to hold that line that they really shouldn't have had. The gods of defense shone down upon the Germans here, holding this line. So as we come to the third month, October 1943, the Russians have to get here to Kiev and get units across the river. They're going to need a massive push, and yet these panzer divisions that shouldn't even be there anymore, that should be wiped out, are still sitting there right in the German defensive line. In the middle, the Russians had much better success. This is the Donets River that they struggled to get across on the first time because, once again, the Russian rolls were bad. They rolled much more averagely in this past month, and they were able to push across the Donets. They've got a number of corps that have pushed across the river and are starting to threaten down here Dnipropetrovsk, and they are on the outskirts right here of, where'd it go? Kharkov, right here. So Kharkov is threatened. We've got a Soviet armored corps right here. It's going to be a push to take it. However, again, the river crossings are over here to the west, and that's the ultimate goal of the Russian offensive. They're going to need a big breakthrough push to be able to threaten this in this next month, because they've only got 2 more months left to accomplish their goals. But big success in getting across the first river. The German defenses still have been able to bend really without breaking, but still, opportunities here for the Soviets and Russians to put forward, but once again, they need to pick up the pace. As we look in the south, we can see this is not an area where the Soviets have really been pushing, but because they've broken through, the Russians have broken through to the north, I've had to start pulling back German units here. But again, the Dnieper River is over here, and this is where they have to get to through this. So there's a lot of work to be done yet for the Russians. Probably in the next month, as the Germans, I'm going to start to slowly withdraw these forces here towards Stalino and probably try to lift this supreme command directive on Stalino, because right now they're being ordered to hold at all costs. I might try to spend one of our negotiation points, that OKH chit, to remove that directive here so that the Germans don't lose the battle because of that city falling. So there you have it. We'll go now to October 1943, turn 3 out of 4. Soviets need a much better performance in the back half of this campaign than they've had in the front half of the campaign. Can they pick up the pace, or are the Germans setting an ahistorical, epic defense and a fighting withdrawal to hold the Soviet offensive at bay? We'll be back to take a look at the results from October 1943 in a minute. Before we take a look at the October 1943 results, I want to talk about one more mechanic for the Soviets here, and that's this airborne chit. This is a one-time only use airborne that's available starting on chit that's available on the 3rd turn. The Soviets have the option of putting this into the cup, and when it's drawn, they conduct an airborne operation. They use the chit as a marker. You can put it on any city and any hex within 8 hexes of an in-supply Soviet unit. And so we dropped it down here on Cherkasy, which is on the other side of the Dnieper River. I think had I played the game before, I would have been aware as the Germans to kind of protect against some of these things happening. But this is a really good option for them, because that gives the Soviets, it's a supply point. This airborne unit drops into this hex as well. So the Soviets have now taken this city, which gives Soviet control to Cherkasy here, and gives the Soviets 5 victory points out of at least the 50 they need. So they have some forces on the other side of the river here. We'll see how this plays out in the last month of the battle. October 1943 saw a huge shift in the Russian fortunes, and things actually could get quite interesting. This line up here in the north for the Germans broke, forcing them to pull back quickly and try to contract their lines here. It is in tatters. The Russians had much better attacks in the north. Reinforcements came in as part of this airborne drop. We put most of them up here in the north. They've almost broken through down here. In addition, along here towards the central region, they've captured Kharkov and almost breaking through here and well as over here. The southern front again kind of stabilized, but the Germans have had to pull back here. Now, what makes this turn interesting is that there are 3 cities still under supreme command order that the Russians could conceivably take in this last month of actions. Because I've been kind of overconfident that these cities were safe, I didn't kind of use OKH chits to pull these supreme command orders, and now 3 of them are in danger. So the Soviets have a chance. I don't think they're going to be able to get enough control points, positions on the other side of the Dnieper River to win. However, they could conceivably get one of these three cities under a supreme command order, depending upon how quickly the Germans can start to play those OKH chits to negotiate with the supreme command to be able to pull them off. So this last turn looks to be very, very interesting as we come into it. Let's take a look at each front in turn. The North Front was supremely interesting in this past month as the Soviets broke through in a number of places, wiped out a number of infantry divisions, finally did some damage to some of the panzer divisions, basically causing this line to collapse. It was only a last-second reorganization by the 4th Panzer Army that allowed them to frantically pull back to try to form some semblance of a defensive line. But this isn't much. There's a lot of spaces here. There's ways to get through as we look down in here in particular. This is a very weak the remnants of an infantry division. The Soviets have a lot of armor in here. This looks like a breakthrough that could lead to where this airborne chit is over here just off the camera, and then Kaniv here, which could get the Soviets across the Dnieper River in force. That's one place where it could break. The Soviets as well could conceivably break across the Dnieper, then drive up this road and threaten Kiev right there. So lots of possibilities for the Soviets to do a lot of damage in this upcoming turn. In the middle as well, just to the south of where this thrust is coming, Soviets have another thrust. The only thing that's stopping it right now is the 8th Army headquarters, which really, in essence, isn't much of a defensive position at all. It's only got a defensive 1. So we can expect the Soviets to push in mass. Depending upon who goes first and how they can activate, the Soviets can push in mass, potentially come down here and get these 2 crossing points as well. So this middle portion, the southern part of the northern front and the northern part of the central front, both are in dire straits for the German forces. Lots of casualties, very successive and aggressive Soviet attacks. Kharkov has fallen as well, and the Soviets in real good position here. Now let's take a look at the south. The south has held better, and I've actually started to try to pull some forces off of the southern line to get them up north to help, because the north is such a mess. But I have started pulling back where I can units from the line here on the Donets River. The idea would be to slowly withdraw, and hopefully some of these troops, if this were going longer than 4 months, could be funneled up to try to reinforce the central and northern positions. Soviets now will just probably, they're reacting to the German withdrawal in this next month, so they will start to move forward. There is a fairly strong force of Russian forces here that could potentially break through here. It might be tricky. If they do, however, they could come here to Dnipropetrovsk, which would be a supreme order command. If the Germans don't lift that before the Soviets could get there, that would be another way for the Russians to win the battle here. So as we head into our final month, things have gotten a lot more interesting. We'll be back in a little bit to look at how this one finally wraps up. So I'm coming back in the middle of the November turn to show the dramatic conclusion. This is the Dnieper River here, and the Soviets are able to break through here in a couple places, getting these control points and push forces past it. Now, they slid an armored unit on the other side of the Dnieper River here, right next to Dnipropetrovsk, which was under a supreme command order, meaning the Germans must hold it. If it falls, the Soviets get an automatic win condition. I was doing everything I can to get the Soviets here, doing everything I can to get the Germans to hold it. It came down to these 4 chits left in the pool for the November turn. If the OKH chit came out, the Germans would have been able to use it to lift the Supreme Command Order, giving them the victory. If the 1st Panzer Army, or the 8th Army chit was drawn, the 1st Panzer Army is here, the 8th Panzer Army headquarters is just to the south, Germans would have been able to have wrap some more forces and pull them back into the city to be able to defend it, and that would have held it. However, the chit that got drawn was the step front chit for the Russians. Their headquarters is right up here. This armored corps is within range and moved in here to Dnipropetrovsk, taking the city, which was under an hold at all costs order for the Germans. So because the Germans weren't able to lift that in time, it triggers an automatic win condition for the Russians. And the Russians, after starting out horribly in September and August and September, put on a massive surge in October and November, and luckily, that is ultimate luck, a 1 in 4 chance pretty much for them to pull out the victory at the end. But they get the activation, their command activates a little bit before the Germans, they're able to move in, take the city, and guarantee trigger the automatic victory on their campaign. Let's take a look at the front and what happened on each one of these fronts too for the final conditions. So here is the final condition at the end of November here, 1943, with the Soviets again triggering the automatic win condition here. Basically, this month started out, the November, was a total collapse of the German north end of their defensive positions. They pulled back here to try to hold Kiev. They pulled back to the Dnieper River, pulling their forces across the Dnieper River. But the Russians then in turn concentrated their activations and headquarters, kind of tag-teaming down here to surge forward through the middle of the German lines, extracting heavy casualties, pushing down here across the Dnieper River, surging units past that, and then again getting to Dnipropetrovsk before the Germans could lift that supreme command order, giving the Soviets the win. Let's take a look at each front in turn. So the northern front here is somewhat barren. Soviet units, the headquarters pushed to the south to kind of concentrate on driving more towards the center. So they kind of left the north in somewhat of a static position here. The Soviets did drive over to the border of Kiev on the Dnieper River. German forces pulled back here along the Dnieper River. But most of the forces that were in here pushing towards Kiev diverted towards that bulge in the central part of the front. So we'll take a look there, basically kind of leaving the north in a more static position to kind of put the emphasis on the center part of the front. So let's take a look at the center. This is where the action happened. Basically, the Soviets concentrated the steppe front in the Vorozhnev front down in here, surging down through the south, pushing across to kind of build off on the airborne control point they established over here. So they got across the Dnieper River here. They broke through before the Germans could react here, capturing these two control points across the Dnieper River. And that's where they were able to kind of start surging through with armor forces to come down in behind the German lines and take Dnipropetrovsk to end the game. They swallowed up a bunch of German units. We can see some German units still out of supply here. We can see some that would fall out of supply shortly. Basically just blasted through the line. Once things tilted in the Soviet favor, it went fast. And it was just a rout for the Russians as they pushed through. Some units in here trying to hold on desperately. The strongest German position still lies down to the south, but it was the total collapse of the center that really triggered the Soviet win. As we look down in the south, it was still somewhat inactive, with neither the Germans nor the Russians kind of spending a lot of time and focus of resources down in the south. Germans gradually pulling back here towards Stalino, but the Russians kind of moving forward and kind of using this central portion to put pressure here. Had this campaign gone on for the full 8 months, I think the Germans would have been in disastrous shape, because with the Soviet forces pushing through from the north, I think they would have been able to create a devastating pocket down here, trapping. I mean, the Germans really would have had to hustle to get around and outside of this corner, and it would have been, I think, almost impossible to establish any kind of a defensive perimeter. I mean, they might have been able to hold the Dnieper River long enough for the Soviets to kind of get bottled up and sneak some of these units. But it would have been, I think the rest of this battle would have been an interesting story to see how the Germans would have been able to try to rescue these units, pull them out and get them back into some kind of defensive position. But that total collapse in the center was just devastating for them. So in the end, Soviets pull out the win. I want to talk a little bit about some thoughts on the game now too. I've got a few impressions to share. Overall impressions, I talked about evaluating the game on 3 parameters. First, is it fun? Are there interesting decisions? Absolutely. This is a very fun, playable game. I really liked playing both sides, the Russians and the Germans. I feel like the chit pull system creates a lot of interesting kind of operational decisions and where you're going to put your points of emphasis. This was a really fun game, and I will also say the rules are very straightforward, very playable, and even down to the fact that like all the counters have their starting hexes on it, and the hex numbers and the units are right here. It makes setup a breeze and storage a breeze. This is just, I think there's a kind of a relentless pursuit of simplicity and elegance in this design that really impacts the game to make it a very, very playable experience. This is a very easy game to get to the table, and I think it's a very enjoyable game to play. Second question I wanted to ask about is how is it play as the Germans? Is it fun to play as the Germans? I'm going to say this, it is fun to play as the Germans, and I thought I was doing really well as the Germans, but I think in retrospect I probably was holding that line a little bit too tightly, because we lost, I think, about 15 divisions or so as the Germans down here, tons of entry, and once that balance started to swing in the Soviets' favor, it became impossible for the Germans to hold the line. Now, as the Soviets control more of these control points, the Germans have the ability with the OKH chits to bring in more reinforcements. So I think that might have helped had the game continued on. But there were also some decisions here that were made because the scenario was going to end after 4 turns. Probably played a little bit differently for both the Germans and the Russians. So I will say, I think it's more fun to play as the Russians because you're attacking. As the Germans, it's very much a defensive game. But those OKH chits, the way you can interrupt, the way you can bring in reinforcements, those supreme command orders, make it a very challenging and engaging situation for the Germans. So it's fun, but I do think the attacking and the offensive role as the Russians is more fun. Third thing we wanted to look at is how does it play Solitaire? Fabulously. It works really, really well, Solitaire. I really enjoyed this. That chit pull system creates a lot of kind of unknowns as you're playing through a turn. Who's going to get their chit? What are you going to do? What order? What sequencing? When the supply comes up? It creates a lot of variability and makes it a very fun system to play both sides Solitaire. The only thing that I think you lose in playing Solitaire is that you don't know what chits your opponent has picked, right? So as the Germans, I know which fronts the Russians picked twice. So I knew I didn't have to worry, for example, too much down here to defend Stalino in the last couple months because I knew this front was only activated once. If you're playing 2-player, you don't know that, so you kind of got to figure where you're going to have some mismatches. You could figure, oh, they didn't pick this one, and then if they do, you could be in a lot of trouble down here because maybe you didn't activate this southern front as the Germans, or vice versa. It can go both ways. That's the only thing I think that you lose a little bit in Solitaire, but I strongly recommend this as a Solitaire experience. Are there any negatives with the game? The one thing I will mention that felt a little bit wonky to me is something that I heard the Player's Aid talking about as well. Alexander and Grant just recently reviewed this game, and Grant was saying he didn't really like the way you could relocate headquarters in the game. And the way headquarters relocation works is that if a result of combat, if they get destroyed in combat, you automatically have to relocate them. But you can also voluntarily relocate them. And the rules for that is they have to be moved at least 5 hexes away. They have to be in supply, and they have to be free of enemy zones of control. Well, you can literally move them across the map to someplace else on the map under those rules. So it feels a little bit odd that a headquarters, for example, that could be way up here in the north, could be voluntarily positioned way down in the south, and then you could activate it, if you had the chit in there twice, activate it and use it to kind of activate all the units that are down in the south part of the map. I'm not sure if that's intentional, accidental, but it creates kind of an interesting dynamic, to say the least, especially because as you can reposition some, so when the Germans, I had them voluntarily reposition some of their headquarters in the way of Dnipropetrovsk down here, that almost were able to allow them to win the game. The Soviets were able to kind of work around it, but you can kind of toss obstacles in your way with the enemies with the headquarters too. Now, in the race to the Dnieper scenario, there's no victory point penalty for doing that. In the campaign game, anytime a headquarters is relocated, it costs you 2 victory points. So in the campaign game, I feel like there's a dampener on that. But in the race for the Dnieper scenario, it felt a little bit unrealistic towards the end as I was kind of having headquarters apparate, 1,000 miles away in a different spot on the map because that's where I wanted to activate some units. So it felt a little bit wonky that way in that scenario, but I would like to play this a few more times to really get a sense for how that works out. So I don't want to say it's a negative yet. It just was kind of a little bit eyebrow raised as to, is that really the way this should work? But other than that, that's really the only negative thing I have to say about the game. This is really fun, strongly recommended, both as a solitaire experience and then as a 2-player experience. This was really fun game to play. I really enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them down below. If you would like to see another similar after-action style report replay, I'm putting a link here to our Save South Vietnam replay, where we play over 5 episodes the entire game Save South Vietnam from Fortress Games. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.